everybody. Welcome. Today's just not a great day. It's a fantastic day because I get to do what I like doing. That is talking on the Energy Newsbeat podcast. My name's Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group, and I've got a really cool guest coming by the podcast today. I've got Tim Hade. He is the Chief Development Officer and co-founder of Scale Microgrids, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. We've had a great chit chat right before we got here.
Hey Stu, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Okay, as a co-founder, what prompted you to go get into Scale Microgrids? Let's talk about what they are. Microgrids. I love microgrids because you take a look at the grid and it's going to have some problems. So assuming we're going to go down that road. And then if you take a look at how did you get started and who's your partner?
Yeah, so the genesis story for us, I think, really started at a previous company. So all three of the co-founders of the company previously worked at a cogeneration company. So it was by the name of Energy Reactors. It was based out in New Jersey. And starting in 2010, when I joined, we were really focused on building cogen projects specifically for C&I customers in the Northeast. And I think the value proposition of cogen made a lot of sense to us, right? Both from a sustainability standpoint, but also an economic standpoint and a resilience standpoint.
Cogen.
And yeah.
I may know what it is, but I'd love for our podcast listeners. Cogen.
Sure. So cogeneration, also sometimes called combined heat and power, is essentially using typically a fossil gas asset to generate both electricity and heat simultaneously. So if you think about, how we typically use natural gas in the electricity mix, you're generating at about, 40 to 50% electrical efficiency. And then the waste heat in a combined cycle plant is reused. In the typical peaker plant, it's not. But that efficiency loss is, potential energy that's not being used on the system. And so cogeneration actually sort of flips that on its head by capturing the waste heat and using it for some sort of useful function. That can be heating, it can be cooling, it can be dehumidification in different applications. But that's really the basics of, cogeneration or CHP.
Yeah. In the industry, the energy space, there's so many acronyms that going around, and that was where I got blasted a lot on some of my earlier podcasts. What was that? So thanks. Keep on going. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, so we were pretty laser focused on cogeneration, but then also very, very closely watching developing markets and developing technologies. And I think the things we were most interested in back in those days was really battery storage, right? What's the story with battery storage? What's the technology curve? How quickly is this going to become a commercially viable product that we can use in the power generation space? And so we were kind of doing that work, had a little, R&D work going on. And then Hurricane Sandy happened. And I think for us, Hurricane Sandy was really kind of a light switch event. As I mentioned, we were based in northern New Jersey, so we were kind of at the eye of the mess that Hurricane Sandy caused. Saw the impact that had on, the local community that we were a part of, but also sort of the region in general. And I think the conclusion that, came to us was that we got to go a lot faster with this stuff. Our infrastructure today really isn't ready for extreme weather events. During a time when, having reliable electricity is becoming increasingly more important to society on almost a daily basis. And so, that was kind of the event that made us step back and think about kind of the direction we were headed, how aggressive we were being, things like that. And ultimately, what that led to was the three of us breaking off and starting Scale in 2015. Since then, we've really been building microgrids that use solar and storage as kind of the hub of the systems we build. But we also still use a lot of dispatchable generators. We still do some CHP projects. We're messing around with all sorts of new energy storage technologies and chemistries. And so it's really become a distributed energy resources focused business. We kind of have our specific menu of technologies that we like, but we're branching out pretty quickly.
Nice. Hey, right before we started, I mean, 40 minutes ago, this is hot off the press. I saw your release on this Scale Microgrids to build clean energy system with the Soba brand Luiseño Indians. I hope I said that right. I didn't want to barbecue anything there.
It's close enough.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so this is a project that we're really excited about, and I think maybe to take a step back, one of the things that we as a company have been thinking a lot about for a long time is the issue of environmental justice.
Right.
And so, one of the downsides or potential downsides of distributed energy is that it sort of puts the buying power of quality electricity in the hands of the consumer. And if that consumer is, always a Fortune 500 company, what the end result of sort of this energy transition will be is a very inequitable solution, right? Yep. Where certain portions of society will have access to a higher quality of electricity service than other parts of society, which is a preventable outcome, but we have to work to prevent it. And so, out of that sort of awareness, we started looking at, different projects that we could work with in low income communities. One of the, things that jumped right on our radar kind of early in that was some of the issues that are happening on tribal lands across the country. And, one of the crazy statistics, to sort of put this in perspective, is less than 1% of the United States population lives on tribal lands. 95% of unelectrified facilities in the United States are on tribal lands. And so,
no way.
Yeah. So for centuries, really.
Say that again. That's
so less than 1% of the U.S. population lives on tribal lands. More than 95% of unelectrified facilities in the country are on tribal lands.
That's
and
disgusting.
So, yeah, it really creates a situation where, for centuries, from an energy infrastructure perspective, tribes haven't gotten a fair shake, and unfortunately have been put in a lot of terrible situations as a result of that. And so, one of the things that decentralized distributed energy does is it allows people to acquire cheaper, cleaner, more resilient kilowatt hours without having to go through a very bureaucratic process typically associated with, dealing with the utility, where your power is coming from, all that kind of stuff. And so we started engaging with tribal lands, different counterparties in the tribal land space, maybe 2.5, 3 years ago. And there was definitely a learning curve for us, both from a technical standpoint, but also from a cultural standpoint. As we kind of learned, how to transact with a tribal entity. Other huge partner for us in these endeavors has been the U.S. federal government. The Department of Energy has been a great partner and has really been looking at this issue, and has made grant funding available and sort of changed some of the rules around tax equity to make some of these projects more feasible to execute. And so through a combination of those, we just announced our first tribal lands project, which as you noted, is at the Soboba Resort in Southern California. Really, really excited about the project. I think it's gonna, the net result is gonna be, we're gonna save the tribe money. We're gonna, clean up their kilowatt hour mix from a sustainability standpoint. And the system's gonna have the ability to island in the event of a grid outage, which means that they can continue to run their operations. So we think it's a great value proposition. We're really excited to, get steel in the ground and start building this thing.
I'll tell you what, okay, I got about 9,000 questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. We got the California grid is old, and it's got problems. In fact, I interviewed an author last year, and it was she was a New York Times author, and it was California Burning was the name of the book. And
I think it was Catherine Blunt, right?
Yes, that was it. And she was very, very smart. I loved reading that book. In fact, it's around here. And I've got yellow tabs all over it and everything. But the grid, being isolated off the grid in this is phenomenal. The disproportionately impacted communities have always, as I say, got it in the drive-through. with it when it comes to getting lousier energy projects to them. I mean, it's like, it seems like that group of people is always not getting it. So,
Yeah.
you know, I am so excited that you're going this route with the smaller grids. From a technical question, though, on all of the folks that I've talked to, you put renewable and then you put solar on there, and then you're going to have to put storage on there. You had mentioned that you have natural gas as a standby into this microgrid. How does all that fit together in a cost-effective solution? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So,
and I'm hoping I'm not giving you a headache, because
no. It's an excellent question, right? So,
Okay.
so look, I think the first thing that you have to think about from a distributed energy standpoint when
Right.
you're looking at different markets is the cost of the status quo, right?
Right.
And
I like
so,
that.
you know, for anyone who's read California Burning or any of Catherine's, you know, reporting that she did at the Wall Street Journal,
Right.
she and her colleague Russell Gold did a fantastic series of pieces on
Right.
PG&E in the wake of the campfire. What sort of the outcome of that is that California has the most expensive, least reliable electricity in the country.
Right.
And so that's not a good combination. And so when you start off talking about, you know, how do you make the economics of distributed energy systems work? The first point is you go to the places where the grid is the worst, right? The least reliable and the most expensive. And in the continental United States, California is up there. And we could talk a lot about sort of how California got in this situation. Some of it is bad luck and some of it is bad management over, you know, decades of time. But the reality of the situation is the California grid is a mess. And so, you know, as a general rule of thumb, the problem that the California grid has right now isn't so much on the generation side, but is on the transmission and distribution side. So generally how the California grid was built is all the generation resources are on the east side of the state, and pretty much all the load is on the west coast of the state. And in order to get from where the electricity is generated to where it's used, you have to run a series of transmission wires over forests that have been in the midst of a 1,000-year drought. So that is not a recipe for success, right? When the wind blows, power lines fall over. When power lines fall over in areas with hundreds of millions of dead trees, fires start. Because of the way the legal structure works in California, utilities are liable for 100% of the costs associated with starting those fires. And so what that means is the utilities are going to have to invest billions of dollars to harden their transmission and distribution system. Those billions of dollars are mostly going to be rate-based, which has a direct impact on customers' bills. So customers' bills are going to continue to go up in the, you know, short and medium term as the utilities do all this work. And then it also means that reliability is likely to go down, because at the end of the day, the only foolproof mechanism that utilities have for not starting major fires is turning the power off. That's a construct called public safety power shutoffs in California, which I think most Californians today are aware of. But essentially, when it's too humid and the wind's blowing too fast, the utility shuts the power off to make sure that they don't start fires. And so once you start pricing in the economic losses of those types of outages, making the economic case for a distributed energy system becomes a lot easier to do. So generally speaking, we will build a system, you know, that sort of has an equivalent cost of about 20 cents a kilowatt hour. That's using solar storage and in a lot of cases, dispatchable standby generators to back up that system. And retail prices right now for a lot of people in California are north of 25 cents. And so that's really the economic case right there. Now, especially if, you know, the cost of retail electricity continues to grow at the pace it's been growing, you know, in the next 5-10 years, I think that's where people really believe that California is going to become kind of the first major economy in the world to move towards a more distributed electricity grid. And that's one of the reasons it's a major market. And we're out here trying to help make that happen.
Tim, great discussion here. Now, in a discussion point, when you're sitting here, let's take Hawaii as an example. And
Sure.
if you cannot get natural gas, oil, coal, or anything, renewables do make a sense, and they're basically on a microgrid anyway, on each island
100%. Yep.
for that kind of a thing. So when we drop in a microgrid and going to that distributed system, I love that. That's a lot easier to get funding in each grid area and focus on those and then tie those in.
Yep.
Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think when you start thinking about the best business cases for microgrids, rural and isolated applications to include
Right.
island nations and island states are very high on the list, right? It makes a lot of sense to deploy these systems in places that
Right.
have traditionally, poor, unreliable, expensive utility grids, and there tends to be a very high correlation between
Right.
the worst utility grids and islands. So yes, that's a good place to start.
Okay. So if you're sitting here and you've got kilowatt per hour, Don Deers's book, he went through, I love visiting with authors and stuff, Clean Energy Crisis.
Yep.
He had in here on the lists of kilowatt hour, and I work with some of the Bitcoin mining guys on stranded gas. They're in the 3 cents, they're really, they're getting down in there. If you're in the 20 cent per kilowatt hour, that's you've got a trapped grid price that you've got to pay in order to go through that. But if everybody else is paying 25 cents and you understand you're paying for extra resiliency, that makes a little more sense in paying for that resiliency. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, I think when we talk about, electricity economics specifically, right, it's really important to differentiate between the difference between wholesale prices and retail prices.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
And, when you talk about, 3 cents a kilowatt hour for natural gas or, 3 cents a kilowatt hour for solar or whatever the case might be,
Right.
traditionally, when people talk about that, they're talking about the cost of generating electricity.
Right.
And, for people worried about electricity economics, the focal point really shouldn't be on the cost of generation, right? That's headed down and has been heading down for decades. And, it fluctuates a little with supply chain issues and, natural gas commodity prices and things like that. But generally speaking, like the trend on the generation side is really clear. The problem we have from an electrical infrastructure standpoint is how do we get the kilowatt hours from where they're made to where they're used? And that's typically, what you see on your utility bill show up as transmission and distribution charges. And in a state like California, roughly 70% of the average consumer's bill is T&D charges. It has nothing to do with the cost of generating electricity. It has everything to do with the cost of delivering electricity from where it's generated to where it's used. So like the analogy people sometimes talk about is like the cost of generating is like what you pay for your car. The cost of transmitting and distributing is what you pay to drive on the highway. And in the case of electricity, the cost of driving on the highway is a lot more expensive than the cost of the car. And so that's sort of a trend that's starting to really materialize in some of these, sort of fringe cases, right? California being, I think, the sort of poster child for this. But it's a trend that, we expect to really continue to happen nationally. And when that's the case, and you're talking about, beating retail prices, not beating wholesale prices, that's where the case for distributed energy resources as an asset class really start to become very attractive. When you're thinking about it from a retail perspective, or from a wholesale perspective, rather, there's still big economies of scale. So it's cheaper to generate, a solar kilowatt hour as part of a 200 megawatt, solar field in the desert than it is to generate that kilowatt hour on your roof. But when you price in the cost of transmission and distribution, it's oftentimes cheaper to generate it on your roof, if that makes sense.
It does. Now, in the United States, there's, if I understand it correctly, there's 3 main sections. Then you have the balancing authorities that buy buy the power from each area. And then you have power stations that are being paid when they're on standby. And then you have that. How does a microgrid fit into a balancing authority when you're trying to, because they're going to pay you for standby power.
Yeah.
And if you've got storage because that goes back into the economics of that storage on the grid, and solar and wind can't do that because a balancing authority can only pay them when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, right?
Yep.
Did I get all that right?
Yeah. Yeah. For the most part. Absolutely.
Okay. For the most part, that's a compliment, Tim, and I'll take it.
I mean, just for those of you who are listening, I mean, what Stu just described in 2 minutes is one of the most complicated systems in the history of mankind. And so it's impossible to give like an accurate summation in 2 minutes, but that's about as good as you can do.
Okay. Well, I will, bless you. I will take that as a compliment. Because
look, I think to your question, right? How we've traditionally done this is we've just circumvented the process, right? So what we've said as distributed energy resources community is, at least in the microgrid space, and this is a little bit different in the residential space, but in the microgrid space, our general approach to it has been, we're just going to take load off the grid, right? So we're going to provide our customer, let's say our customer has a peak demand of 1 megawatt. We're going to provide them with 500 kilowatts of steady state power. That's going to come from a combination of resources, but it's always going to be 500 kilowatts. And so therefore you only need to get 500 kilowatts from the grid now, right? Now that's a very inefficient way to design these systems at scale. And a few years ago, FERC, which is kind of the governing body for the system that Stu just described, issued an order called 2222. So FERC 2222, which basically ordered those independent system operators to come up with plans for how do you incorporate these distributed energy resources into the broader grid mix. Again, that's a vast oversimplification, but for the purposes of today's conversation, that we can kind of leave it there. But yes, exactly what you're talking about happening is now happening, where we're having conversations with different balancing authorities, utilities, independent system operators, to talk about, okay, if we have some extra capacity in our microgrid and the grid needs capacity, how do we deploy that capacity to the grid to help lower the cost for everyone? And how do we get compensated for that as a distributed energy resource provider? And there's starting to be some progress. I think that, one of the challenges with the electricity system in general is it's incredibly bureaucratic and everything takes a long time to happen, right? And so I think, that order was issued in 2020. Not as much progress has happened in terms of actually having, meaningful change happen over the past 3-ish years. As we would like to have seen. It's kind of been a slow moving process. There's been a lot of pushback in a lot of different areas from regulators, utilities, you name it, as well as our industry, as we've been kind of, trying to weigh in on this stuff as well. But we're starting to see progress. And so, at this point in time, CAISO, which is the California Independent System Operator, New York ISO, have made real progress on these issues. ISO New England, PJM, organizations like that aren't far behind. And so I think we're starting to get to a point where aggregated distributed energy resources, which is kind of the buzzword, the asset class, have a path to providing real value when the grid needs it. And that's a market ecosystem that I think is going to continue to evolve over the coming decades. But, the good news is that technically it's 100% viable to do. It's really just a conversation about economics and how we're going to compensate independent power producers like myself for providing those services to the grid when the grid needs it. And so, it's a long conversation. There's a lot of moving parts, but I'm very optimistic that we're going to find a resolution and, continue to build on that over the years to come.
Cool. I got more questions. Tim, you are brilliant because I'm sitting here thinking in my old head, I would keep thinking of all these questions. Maybe one day I'll get a crayon and start writing down. But when we sit down and take a look, you've got a question coming up on supply chain,
Yep.
because you may have a deal. How are you going to get transformers, or how are you going to get these things? Let's start with that question first. Let's say a tribe or a disproportionately impacted community says, Tim, go. Isn't there a supply shortage on all this stuff?
Yeah, 100%. So look, I think, this is not specific to distributed energy resources, although our industry has absolutely been impacted, but the supply chain, global supply chain right now is a mess. And, regardless of what you're talking about, whether it's transformers or switchgear, solar modules, gas generators, alternators, whatever you can kind of think of, we've seen lead times double or triple over the past 18 months. So, pieces of equipment that we used to get in 20 weeks are now 60 to 80 weeks of lead time.
Man,
it's a very, very tough environment. Now, I think, when I think about like sort of energy markets and the energy transition, I try to think about things over long time horizons, right? So, I think that, over the next 20, 25, 30 years, there's a very compelling case to make that, distributed energy resources are going to grow at a really unprecedented clip, and are really going to be sort of the backbone of the 21st century electricity system. If you think about that over a 3, 4, 5-year time frame, I think it's going to go a lot slower than people anticipate because of a lot of the supply chain issues that you brought up. And so there are a lot of good things happening, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act, as an example, allocated billions of dollars to standing up domestic manufacturing capabilities to deal with a lot of the critical technologies that, sort of encompass what we're talking about today. Those plants are going to be built and they're going to come online, but it takes time to build a factory. It takes time to commission a factory. It takes time to get it working right. And so, whether that happens, in 2025 or 2028,
longer to get it permitted.
Yeah, that kind of stuff is very much up in the air. And so, yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, right, there's a lot of movement throughout the industry to correct this problem. I don't think it's a easily correctable problem. I think it's going to take time. And so I do think there's a lot of reason to be concerned about the, deployment of these types of assets over like a 3 to 5 year time frame. If you think about it over sort of a longer term, right, I think the trend is a lot more stable.
That's a great answer, because my head hurts when I think about trying to get this stuff. A nuclear reactor cannot be even, they've been 15, 20 years just to even get permitted. And then this weekend, we had 2 power plants go bankrupt back up east because of the fines that they got fined in December because they didn't have enough power in order to do it. So, I mean, we're talking some serious problems here. I interviewed Adrien Lotto. She was the SVP of grid security with the American Public Power. It just went out just here, and they were saying that it could be 2 years for some transformers if we had a big enough problem go out.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think not a lot of people appreciate, and I think part of this is human nature. But the electric grid that we rely on today is very fragile, a lot more fragile than I think people would like to admit. If you care to learn more about this, my favorite book on the topic is a book called Lights Out that was written by Ted Koppel, the old Nightline anchor.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so he wrote a great book about this called Lights Out, and it definitely kept me up for a few weeks. I think ultimately, when you look at a lot of the critical infrastructure on which our grid is reliant, there aren't ample spares, right? And so if we have a problem, or whether it's a physical attack or a cyber attack or a natural disaster, there are certain critical junctures of our electric grid that if they're damaged, it could take months to fix, right? I mean, we saw that with the Winter Storm Uri in Texas a few years ago,
Right.
where the grid was like right on the edge of basically blowing up, and it could have taken months to repair. That would have been a humanitarian disaster of fairly unprecedented scale. And so, I think ultimately, part of the challenge when we talk about the energy transition is, how do we price risk like that into our economic decisions? Typically when you talk about, public utility commissions and ratepayer advocates and folks like that, they get very, very focused on cost per kilowatt hour as a metric, assuming that cost per kilowatt hours prices in all these externalities, but it doesn't. And so, you can make a very compelling argument that, definitely in certain areas of the country, people should be willing to pay a premium for kilowatt hours that deliver more reliable and resilient power. That mechanism mathematically doesn't exist in rate cases today. And it's one of the reasons that I think personally that a lot of public service commissions make mistakes in terms of how they procure energy. But, again, that's a conversation that's happening at sort of the highest levels of the regulatory environment. And, hopefully there'll be, some evolution there.
Okay. Economics. In ERCOT, we have a bazillion. That's a technical term. I went to Oklahoma State University. So a bazillion is actually a number.
T. Boone Pickens.
I love T. Boone. Boy, he's been nice to the OSU. Now, all these wind farms are out in West Texas. The transmission lines were several $1 billion to get those transmission lines back. So a microgrid is with a distribution
line. Yeah.
Thank you. Is getting that piece of the puzzle out, and then their power sources are closer. And that makes it easier for cutting the cost down for that microgrid, depending on how the budget is put in. Did I get that?
That's exactly right. I mean, one of the reasons that, people are bullish about microgrids, but distributed energy more broadly, is that we are not reliant on transmission lines and transmission build out. So, as you think about sort of the energy transition, it's pretty clear that the biggest bottleneck right now is the ability to expand our transmission system, build out transmission lines. Interestingly enough, one of the reasons that happened in Texas is because ERCOT is unique, right? And so you can build a transmission line from West Texas to Houston with, on a relative basis, very little bureaucracy. If you try to build that same line from Oklahoma to Memphis, it's a problem, right? Because of eminent domain issues and a lot of other sort of political things that go into it. And so, that's the situation we're in right now, where there is a queue of clean energy projects that are trying to come online, but are unable to because they don't have access to the transmission system. The only way to solve that problem is to expand the transmission system, and expanding the transmission system is one of the hardest things to do in the infrastructure world. And so again, there's, progress being made on that. This has been a focal issue for the Biden administration. Secretary Granholm has been working on this. The folks at the DOE, the folks at FERC are working on this, but there hasn't really been a resolution. And so, ultimately, I think that, in some ways, distributed energy represents a hedge against what happens if we can't do everything with the transmission system that some of these like very fancy academic models say we need to do to transition to, 80, 90, 100% clean energy. And I think, again, that's one of the reasons that we're fairly bullish on the asset class, is because, we've talked to a lot of people who have tried to build transmission systems, and it's not an easy endeavor.
Now, modular nukes really make a lot of sense to drop into microgrids. I mean, wouldn't that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's, I guess, somewhat of a controversial topic. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't have my mind made up on it yet. Right. I mean, I guess the first thing, to say about SMRs is, we only really look at, technologies that are commercially available today, right?
Right.
And so I don't spend a lot of time thinking about SMRs because there's no
Right.
vendor I can go out and buy an SMR for that's, even
Right.
got a chance of being permitted, right? And so I think, like we talk about with traditional reactors, the question for the SMR community is how are
Right.
you going to get around the permitting issue, right? I typically,
Right.
in order to make money, need to be able to build and commission a project in 24 to 36 months. And
Right.
so if there's a 5-year permitting window on the front end of
Right.
that I have to, navigate in order to get an SMR commissioned, it's kind of a
Right.
deal breaker for us from an economic
Oh,
standpoint.
you can't
So
do it.
yeah, look, I think when you think about it from a technology standpoint, from, the base load properties that it provides to an energy system, from the fact that it is, carbon-free, sustainable electricity, I'm a huge proponent of the idea of SMRs. The
Right.
question is, how practical is it? And that's something that, I don't really have a view on other than to say I'm rooting for it to happen. But, when it happens and how people in that industry are going to be able to navigate that bureaucracy is, I don't really have a clear view on. So that's kind of where I
Right.
think the barrier is today in the market.
Um, the okay, the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, you and I are talking about the single biggest problem in the United States, and nobody is really talking about it, and that is the grid. And both of those, there's only $36 million in there
Yeah.
for grid replacement or upgrades.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we get, we're printing money like you wouldn't believe, which is increasing inflation, but there's zero backbone money in how to get that grid fixed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So look, I was pretty involved in both the IIJA and the IRA. I followed it
Okay.
closely. I tried to provide input where I was able to provide input. And I think at the end of the day, right, what you're saying is fundamentally correct, right? Which is in some ways, both the IIJA and the IRA are kind of like bringing a knife to a gunfight, right? To use kind of that analogy,
Yes.
right? I think if you really understand what's happening, globally when it comes to the intersection of energy infrastructure and climate change,
Right.
this is, in my opinion, the biggest problem the human race has ever faced, right? And I think in a lot of ways, our
Right.
ability to continue to, flourish and leave a better world to our kids than we inherited, is fully dependent on our ability to respond to the energy transition. And so, yeah, my view is that there's not enough money in this for anything.
Right.
You think about, sort of roughly $400 billion that was allocated to this type of stuff in the IRA, which, on one hand is the biggest investment a government has ever made in sort of a climate bill, globally, right? So it's, number one in terms of the most important things a government has ever done to sort of combat climate change and facilitate the energy transition. It's still not enough. And I think there are a lot of people making that argument throughout the process.
Right.
Look, I think ultimately what this came down to is that, the way the federal government was, represented at the time,
Right.
there were senators who needed to vote on this who were very, very concerned about the inflation issues
Right.
that you raised earlier. And that is not my area of expertise. And I think they're right to be concerned about that. I don't know how much on a relative
Right.
basis. But that was ultimately the trade-off, right? I think there were people advocating for this to be a multi-trillion-dollar package, which in my mind would have been more commensurate with the scope of the problem. But
Right.
we took what we could get, and I think some is better than nothing, and so there's reason for optimism on that front. And then yeah, look, I think the optimist in me says that a lot of these new technologies that are coming onto the grid were pretty close to economic parity prior to the IRA and the IIJA. and maybe those are just kind of the nudge that pushed them over the edge.
Right.
But yeah, I wish it was more money. And I think especially in terms of, grid reliability and grid infrastructure, that's probably one area that, most underperformed in terms of, the legislative focus on that and the amount of money that was allocated to it.
I think the education process on this, just quickly going back to the small modular nuclear reactors, I visited with Thomas Jam. He was the co-founder of Copenhagen Atomics out of Copenhagen.
Yep.
Super neat product that they have coming out. They've already got it running, and that's a thorium reactor. And they're going to be able to build starting next year 360 a year of small modular nuclear reactors. So Tim, if we can get that permitting thing done, 2 weeks ago, the DOE put out and said 80% of the coal plants that are shutting down would be eligible for a small nuclear reactor. So the DOE is already kind of primed.
Yeah.
Got these coming around the corner. Boy, how do you help get that permitting rascal animal? If the DOE's already, Department of Energy's already got that rascal almost cooked, it seems like you're almost there to really blow up microgrid.
No, look, I mean, I think one of the things that has been one of the most pleasant surprises over the last few years has been the performance of DOE since the administration changed over. So, I mean, I guess just to put this out there, like, I'm not a partisan person. I, came from the military. I don't really talk about politics very much. So I try to be like very objective about this stuff. But look, I think like the team that Secretary Granholm's put together is staffed with some of the best leaders in the energy industry, people who really understand like the real world impacts and how this stuff actually works in practice. And they're doing some remarkable things, right? One of which is, I think they are the most forward-leaning government organization in the world when it comes to the proliferation of nuclear energy. And that is maybe not something that's on the headlines of all the papers, right? But if you actually go and look at what they've been doing in the nuclear sector, the DOE Loans Program Office is the reason that we just commissioned our first nuclear reactor in 30 years. I think it actually started producing electricity for the first time like last week. They're I think being very aggressive on the SMR front. They're doing a lot to build up our workforce in terms of the ability to build nuclear reactors at a predictable cost. So there's a lot of exciting things happening in the market.
Right.
And again, right, the question remains like, how are you going to deal with this permitting stuff? Because to this day, if you want to build a nuclear reactor pretty much anywhere in this country, you're typically looking at a multi-decade fight with, the local community, all the different stakeholders that are involved. And until that process changes, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to make an economic case for new nuclear. Now, the other side of this argument, right, is what do we do with existing nuclear? And I think that is a very obvious answer, which is we need to keep it running as long as humanly possible.
Right.
And so where I do sort of get annoyed about this is when people talk about decommissioning existing nuclear reactors. That's just like a loss for everyone, and no one should talk about that. We shouldn't focus on it. But look, I do think when it comes to, talking about building new nuclear and the role it plays in the energy transition, we have to figure out how to get the permitting process to be more reasonable. And until we do that, there aren't a lot of private sector businesses or investors who are going to take a chance on it, right? That's just kind of, where it's at. And so, hopefully that's a fixable problem. I know there are a lot of smart people working on it.
There you go. I'll tell you, it's kind of like Diablo Canyon in California got extended. It's roughly 10% of the power in California. And then you sit back and take a look at some of the things. France, we have to keep, Tim, you nailed a big point. France, we have 90 some odd, 92, whatever the reactors are. France has 50. 25 of those are offline because they
Yeah.
haven't put any maintenance money in them. Oh, you got to pay maintenance on these things, and it is a cheaper kilowatt per hour because it's steady. Now, the modular reactors, and I love Thomas, so maybe we could hook you guys up because
Yeah, I'd love to talk to him.
that would be amazing, seeing your microgrid and theirs. It would be a marriage made in heaven. So
Yeah, no, look, I think again, it's really exciting, technical developments on that front. And again, it's just a matter of how practical is it from a deployment standpoint.
right.
And look, I think those are the questions people are asking in the market today, right? There's no doubt in the world that you can build a small modular reactor. Look, I think there are questions about the economic price point that you can build it at, right? But it's a known technology, right? I mean, I think for those who doubt that, right, like half of the U.S. Navy's fleet runs on small modular reactors, right? And has been for 45, 50 years. And so, it's not a question of does this stuff work? It's a question of how long is it going to take to get one of these sited in whatever community you're trying to power. And, unfortunately, in today's market environment, it's too long. And so that's essentially the problem that has to be fixed. And again, I think having conversations about it is what we need to be doing at the highest levels of government and grid planning.
I'll tell you what, Tim, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I just love visiting about all sides of the energy aspect. We got about 2 more minutes. What is coming around the corner for your grid? And then what's coming around the corner for Tim?
Yeah. So look, I think the thing I'm really excited about right now, and the thing I've been spending a lot of time working on, is the concept of what's called a virtual power plant, which we kind of touched on when we were talking about sort of how do we aggregate microgrids together to provide grid services. But for in the 1-minute version of this is that if you build 50 microgrids in the same community, the value of interconnecting those together and operating them as one asset makes the sum greater than the parts, right? And so that's kind of the general concept of a virtual power plant, is how do you take a bunch of distributed energy resources, network them together, and operate them so they look to the grid like a standard central power plant looks. And so, I think that's the next iteration of distributed energy resources. And that's what I'm really excited about and spending a lot of time on right now. It's very tricky. Again, like a lot of the conversations, not as tricky from a technical standpoint as it is from a regulatory and a market operations standpoint, which, by the way, I think is a common theme, right? A lot of the barriers to doing this stuff are business problems. They're not engineering problems. But, that's what I'm working on, right? Trying to get over some of the humps on the business side of things to make these things work and be able to send them out into the wild. And so really excited about that. And I think it'll be the next, sort of big thing that comes out with our business. But we got a lot going on, and it's an exciting time to be part of this market, and it's so much fun talking about it. And I really appreciate the chance to do so with your audience too.
Okay. What's the website for everybody?
ScaleMicrogrids.com if you want to learn more.
Okay. And I'm going to have your LinkedIn contact in there. And we want people to reach out to you with any questions and everything else. I just truly enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for stopping by.
Likewise, Stu. Thanks for having me.